Welcome back to Wisdom in Exile Radio. Thanks again to everyone who's been commenting on the channel. And if you're new to the channel and it's your first time, welcome. We're talking about Lama Jambataya's book, Wisdom in Exile, Buddhism in Modern Times. And today we're going to be discussing chapter 3, which is all about science and Buddhism's relationship to science in the modern world. Norin, looks like you've been practicing, you've been doing some science there. What's going on there?
Well, why aren't you practicing science? That's the bigger question. I'm a bit worried about that. Are you against science in some way? Are you anti-science?
Are you worried about transmission over the airwaves? I'll put this on. So if you feel more comfortable, no. Come on.
Is that what this whole podcast is going to be about now? We're just going to be anti-science?
Well, we are getting a bit of a reputation for bashing everything. So why don't we see if we can bash all of science?
This is what I have to wear to like go and see people who are dying. They don't care though, by the way. Most people don't care if I wear it like this. As long as I'm wearing it, as long as I've checked that box, no one really cares.
So the introduction to the chapter, or the first point made in the chapter, is that some people are claiming that Buddhism should become more scientific. Thoughts?
Yeah, well, you can sort of see the case for it, isn't it? And why it's so popular, because science is so embedded in our society and there's so many clear benefits that have come from science. The impacts on the health industry, you know, helping people to get over sicknesses, and our whole way of living, isn't it? It's so caught up with made so much easier with science. You know, well, why not?
Norin, should we make Buddhism more scientific? I think it's a thumbs up from Haddon. So if we can get your buy-in, I think we're going to be cool to go.
You know, so how can we scientifically prove that, like, if you practice Buddhism, you're going to be happier as an autonomous entity, as an individual, as a self? You can't, because Buddhism says that all suffering comes from clinging to self, or the illusion of self. So we're kind of screwed from the outset, to be honest. I think that...
I think in the book, is it Lama Jambata distinguishes science from scientism. And I think that's a really important distinction, isn't it? So science is a practice, is the way, you know, where we take a very disciplined approach to isolating observable phenomena, developing sophisticated hypotheses around how that physical phenomena will behave given different causes, conditions. And then you can test out these different theories and prove which ones are right or wrong to some degree, and that help you make stuff and do stuff in the world. So I don't think that's a problem. But scientism then is more this sort of then faith that somehow science can then uncover all we need to know about the world and our position in the world. And so rather than just being what scientific method is, which is, you know, physical phenomena, the scientist takes the position of the impartial observer observing the world, how does that going to answer something about, but what is it to suffer, and what's the cause of suffering? How do you relate it to our conscious experience of the world, our sentient conscious experience of the world? It can't answer any of that, and it wasn't designed to answer that. Science is about the external world and how to manipulate it and explain it. It was never originally, science is in its pure sense doesn't try to answer those sorts of questions.
What is the difference or the relationship between scientism and materialism? Are they the same thing?
Initially, I thought they were pretty much the same thing, but maybe you'll disagree. But maybe, so we mentioned scientism is some sort of belief that science is the main, only real valid form of knowledge in the world, and it can explain and help with everything. I guess that's the broad sense of scientism. But usually, I mean, personally, what I often hear people talk about science, but really scientism, is often this notion, this assumption that all there is in the world is the physical, which, you know, philosophically is in we call philosophical materialism. All there is matter in the world. And because that assumption means, therefore, science, which is the study of of matter and material processes can therefore explain everything in the world. If everything is reducible just a physical process and matter, then in principle you can sort of see why science could be able to answer everything. So things like, we can see there's a direct connection between our experience of the world and our senses and our brain and so on. So you can see there's some level of dependence there. So if it's true, everything is just matter, then science does take on this, semi-religious possibility. It can explain and help us solve for everything in principle. So I sort of see that as often an assumption in people making grandiose claims about what science can and cannot do, that they're sort of assuming that everything is matter.
Materialism is not new. It's not even modern. It's ancient. It goes back to ancient Greece. And one of the tricks that it's got now that's allowed it to come back with a vengeance is to kind of glob on to science.
Wait, what are the differences again? Because it's like science, I have to keep reminding myself, science is just a very, very good tool at understanding physical processes. And none of us are questioning that. But scientism then implies that is the only source of knowledge that there is. And that's a philosophical view of materialism, that physical matter is all that there is. Never mind about consciousness and anything transcendent. It's just physical processes. And it's so easy to just like blur those boundaries between the two.
But when you start studying even Western philosophy, you realize there is no proof about how everything is matter. When we look at ourselves, isn't it? And this is when when you encounter Buddhism, you start doing meditation and so on, you start to look at our actual experience. What do we experience moment to moment and day to day in life? And when you start to confront that honestly and with space and reflection, you're confronted by our mind, our experience of the world. When you start to examine mind, that awareness is all pervasive. And yet there's nothing solid you can observe about it, because it's the thing like doing the observing in a way. It's like, it's all pervasive to everything we can experience and observe, and yet itself, awareness, mind is non-graspable, it's insubstantial. And so how do you get from that experience of the world to then, how's everything's just matter? Like the science itself doesn't answer it, because the scientific method just assumes the scientist is the immaterial observer, and then we observe the physical world and make hypotheses about the world. It can never, but it's just an assumption. There's an assumption there. Yeah. And then in Scientism or Materialism then says, but the physical is all there is.
It's a light that can be shined on a problem, but who's shining that light? And if they are driven by some kind of dogma, then they're only going to shine their light on a particular corner of the world, and that denies a lot of the fluidity of phenomenon in general.
So we've distinguished science, scientism, and materialism. I think even in materialism, there's a bit of a distinction between the materialism meaning everything is just material, matter, physical substances, which is a sort of philosophical view. But we also talk about materialism meaning a sort of shallowness in culture. So at a higher level, just day to day, without thinking about the ultimate nature of reality, materialism means material objects, Amazon deliveries. Well, I'm always talking about getting your Amazon deliveries, eating food, the day-to-day requirements and drives of life, and not looking beyond. So is there a relationship between this worldview that everything is just matter, which is one kind of materialism, and the shallowness that doesn't seek anything beyond the immediate gratification of desire, which is another form of materialism?
I assume they were two different meanings for the same word, and that they're separate things.
Materialism cannot explain how sentience arises from non-sentient causes. Science is limited to material processes.
That's not true.
Go on.
I can explain completely how sentience arises using science and science alone.
Cool. Go on then.
Well, basically, just a series of, hormonal, neurochemical exchanges in the brain that creates, awareness. That's it. Sentience, awareness, consciousness, neurological, my ability to understand the material world.
Yeah.
My ability to watch Netflix, actually.
Exactly what is the relationship between awareness and the physical brain? So people do talk about in increasingly materialistic terms, the dopamine hit. You always hear this term now, like, when you're on Facebook or whatever, you get your dopamine hit. I'm not on Facebook. I'm banned for life. I just learned this week. But yeah, you get your dopamine hit, they say. But what? I mean, what does that add to saying you have a feeling of pleasure? Nothing. And another term I hear again and again: our brains are hardwired to do certain things.
It's this implication that the nervous system is really the root of consciousness itself.
And this is a great example of scientism, because the idea that the brain has wires in it is put forward as a serious suggestion, and that it determines your behavior. So you're entitled to ask, well, is that a scientific observation, that brain being hardwired to do certain things is masquerading as a serious scientific theory, when it's just obviously not? It's obviously a metaphor that's attached itself to science. And this is the trick of scientism, is it puts forward something that's sort of superficially plausible, and if you don't think about it very deeply, it sounds quite compelling, and because it's got a proximity to science.
Yeah, I mean, it's the proximity thing, isn't it? I mean, it's such a subtle point. You see movies and TV and stuff, trying to tackle this area, and like you say, it lurches some science into something far more about art and culture than the science, because there is that, because you can obviously prove clearly that some of the things we're aware of, and some of the things even that drive our experience, do have a physical basis. That's the thing, and you can't deny that, is it? So to your point about hardwired, though, I mean, that's the things like, we are hardwired. We have certain instincts which are biologically part of us and our DNA around things like the urge to eat food in order to survive. It's the survival instincts or the procreation instincts or those sorts of things. There's an element you can sort of see, because by just changing the brain or your chemical composition in your body, you can change how you experience those things and change the world. So there clearly is clearly a relationship between mind and our experience and our physical basis. I think to your point, isn't it, the jumping off point is then to say, but the mind bit, the awareness bit, which you can't observe but is all pervasive, that bit just somehow comes up out of very complex physical stuff, and then it just sort of happens. And that's the bit which is a leaping off point.
So science does tend to look for absolute laws to quantify something. And so when you apply it to the problem of consciousness, it itself becomes problematic, because consciousness is something that's fluid, and it's very hard to quantify in any kind of empirical terms. And it's kind of like a short circuit in some regards for science, because if you try to pin it down to a set of hard absolute rules and definitive status and say this is what consciousness is, you're going to be constantly having to revise those rules. And we see this in science, like you had mentioned that previously, in terms of how science itself is an evolving understanding of physical matter and physical forces. It is constantly being revised itself. They've been not just updated and fine-tuned and improved upon, but they've been radically disproved, and now it's gone in a different direction in terms of the evolution of science. And I think, Adrian, you'd mentioned is it Thomas Kuhn's History of Scientific Revolution?
Yeah, the structure of scientific revolutions. Yeah, that points out that science does develop through what he calls paradigms, which are these huge structural systems. So it's not just one theory and a refinement of one theory, but moving forward in incommensurable stages.
Right.
Which does make it impossible to say that one scientific theory is the ultimate definitive theory.
And he had defined what a paradigm is, a combination of like sociology, enthusiasm, and scientific promise. And so, you know, a lot of those things are very subjective. You know, enthusiasm and sociology very dependent upon temporal things.
Well, there's also for scientism, there's also the insurmountable problem which they never even attempt to address, which is the relationship between biology and physics. Because increasingly the materialist wants to say that your brain determines all of your behavior and perception and understanding physically. But on the other hand, like there's physics, which says that the subatomic level determines all of these things. It's all determined at the subatomic level. And they can sort of hand wave and say, well, actually biology is reducible to physics. But that's never been shown how to do that. You have microbiology, which shows how some biological phenomena have a physical structure, and what that physical structure is. But biology, as a source of knowledge, and certainly neuroscience, has not been anywhere closely shown to how it can be analysed into a subatomic level. So again, scientism is claiming for itself, or making promises that it just can't keep, and predictions about the future which just never ever come true, and it just has to sort of string you along and say, well, it's coming. And another great example is their belief that there's going to be a grand unified theory of everything, where all these different levels, including biology and physics, will come together in one. So when's it coming? What's the path to get there? They have no idea. They can talk about superstrings or something as the basis of it all, but it's. And actually, Lama Jampa makes this great point in the book, which is that there's a paradox there, which is that if all knowledge is scientific, and only genuine knowledge is the only genuine knowledge is scientific knowledge, whence comes scientism? Because all of its claims are not scientific. It has no scientific basis for its own claims. This is how logical positivism, which was form scientism in the early 20th century, got refuted. Its verification principle, which is the basis that all knowledge can be empirically verified, was not itself a scientific or verifiable principle. It was self-refuting, and so is scientism.
The body of the Buddha's teachings need only be defended by direct experience and reasoning. And we have, you know, it has no need to borrow from these things from science. But that begs the question, how is reasoning any different from science?
Logical reason is a way of deducing conclusions from some initial axioms or premises about the world, you might say. So science uses reason. You know, so essentially in science, generally you're testing a hypothesis against observable phenomena. So science is never blind. You don't just go in. And, you know, some people may have a naive view of science that, you know, you observe first, and then the reason, the cause, and the explanation, the theory appears. But it's not like that at all. It's actually, you know, you already have a theory, and then you test phenomena to see if your theory might be correct. And so, which is also why I like seeing in terms of scientific progress, as you get more and more sophisticated and different observable phenomena, a theory may become limited and even refuted by some phenomena, and therefore you postulate other alternative theories that may explain it more fully and counter these other observable phenomena as well. So there's an element of reason in terms of you've got to come up with some theory, I guess, up front, and then use scientific method to prove or disprove that theory, and then build on the theory. But yeah, so that's one aspect. So you use the reason in science.
You made a point of scientific reason has to have a hypothesis, and I think Thomas Kuhn had mentioned that you can't get away. It's very difficult, at least, to get away from the human factor in initially coming up with a hypothesis. But go on, sorry, I just wanted to.
Yeah, well, I was just going to say a little bit about direct experience.
Yeah.
Because what does that mean? Because I guess in science, you've got the direct experience of being the observer in a scientific experiment. So in a way, there's that sense of direct experience. All of science is based on observing, and you need a scientist to observe and interpret what is being observed. So there is that, but what is lacking, and what you have in Buddhism, is more the direct examination of our experience in its own right, and that question of the nature of awareness awareness versus what is arising within awareness as the observable phenomena. So and that's only something you can access as a sentient being, and it's everything that we are in a way. Everything that could possibly experience arises through this, the vast space of awareness. And that's something you just got to look at and then ask the question: well, what is it? Where is it? And when you look at it, there's some of the meditation techniques in Buddhist tradition. Part of it, you're sitting down and say, okay, so where is the self in this awareness? What is awareness? Does it have a shape? Does it have a color? Does it have a smell? Does it have a location? How does it exist through time? Is it the same? Where is time arising through my experience of awareness? And so you're directly trying to uncover the mystery, of the intangible nature of awareness itself. And so in Buddhism, we believe there's value in that, because that's the sort of the secret of what it is to exist, the meaning of existence, the value of life. All comes from that recognition of awareness. Whereas in Scientism, well, science doesn't even try to answer it at all. It just assumes, you observe, there's an awareness observer, but you never try and say what that awareness is. And now with this notion of neuroscience, the rest of it, trying to reduce the experience of awareness of being a sentient being into physical observable phenomena. You made the point earlier, maybe it sounded like maybe at some point it could answer it. It can never answer it. Science will never be able to answer that, because as we can see from our own experience sitting in meditation, awareness has no graspable, observable aspects or qualities to it. And so science can never answer the question of what is the nature of awareness.
That process of meditative inquiry, looking at phenomena, that sounds quite scientific. So we can just check the box that Buddhism meets the criteria. It's scientific.
Yeah, I'll jump in. Actually, when you look at science, and this will help, maybe this will answer your point, Norin. When you look at science, there isn't really an essence to it. And when you try and find a scientific method, you actually can't find it. They did try and set out what the scientific method was, that because there's a lot of resting on it. If science is our Lord and Savior, what is it? What's the essence of it? And so they tried to set out. Remember the canons of induction was one attempt in the 19th century to specify what scientific knowledge is and how you get to it. Verification principle was another one. But all of these things failed. It turns out science has no core. It's some sort of, and this is one thing that Thomas Kuhn pointed out, it's a kind of loose collection of practices, use of technology, certain kinds of technology, use of certain social practices like peer review, but none of these things, peer review, technology, none of these things are keys to the ultimate nature of reality. They're all just techniques. So really there is no essential difference between scientific knowledge and other forms of knowledge. It's just another form of knowledge. So a couple more points. We're talking about scientific Buddhism. So let's talk about meditation and brainwaves. So it turns out that you can get these devices. Do you remember, like in Ghostbusters, where he had like all of the wires on his head, and they were doing science on that guy? Turns out you can do that with meditators. I think it's called an encephalograph or something.
EEG, yeah, encephalograph.
Okay. What is it?
Yeah, we've been invited to our centre. We've got emails inviting us to participate in some studies on that if we want to. We'll see.
Okay.
But yeah.
So, all right. So what's wrong with that?
In the book, he points out like how your heart rate, and your breathing might change, and there might be indications of a calmer or a different kind of brain activity during meditation. But that's just observing the processes itself. It's not really kind of telling us anything about anything deeper than that. It's kind of like recording your mileage as you're driving.
Yeah, no, that's exactly it, wasn't it? It's like, so what, isn't it? Yeah, so, you sit in meditation and your physical body may change, brainwaves may change, so what? And I guess this is sort of pointing out the problem with trying to reduce everything to an observable physical phenomena is you lose what it is to exist, what it is to live, and your intention, what are you trying to achieve through an activity. You lose all coherence from a meaningful point of view by reducing it to matter. So, if you're sitting on it in meditation in order to achieve, overcome the disturbing emotions and ignorance about the nature of reality and achieve Buddhahood for the benefit of all beings. That's the context, that's the meaning of what you're doing and why you're doing it. You can't say, and that's because this part of the brain was, stimulated a bit more than that part of the brain. That's really what you were doing. It's sort of a meaningless. I say, like the mileage, like you say, rather than actually traveling from A to B for some reason.
I actually remember, Norin, back in the 1990s, we used to write letters before email. And I remember having a letter from you, I think I was still at university, and as a joke, you were saying you were working on an enlightenment serum. You probably don't remember this, like 25 years ago, but it was funny. But at the time, I don't think we realized how that joke was actually going to become this massively funded program. Because that's what they're doing. They want to invent the enlightenment serum. I mean, that's the promise. That's the implicit promise. If you can measure someone's brain waves well enough and crack the code of the brain states, then you can turn that into physically something that can be physically administered, like an injection into your brain, or a chip or something that goes on your brain and saves you all of the hard work.
Your medication.
What's in the horse pill?
It's just medicine. It's good for you.
Yeah, but I don't like the idea of taking something if I don't know what it is.
Don't get upset, Mr. McMurphy.
I'm not getting upset, Miss Pilbo. It's just that I don't want anyone to try and slip me saltpeter.
And that's one of the scariest things, isn't it, about a society that believes this stuff so strongly. And where will this go? Because Brave New World, the book, Aldous Huxley's Brave New World is like that. And you can sort of see that the thinking nowadays is similar. Like, okay, well, maybe we just need the right prescription of drugs and you can be happy all the time. You know what I mean? The antidepressants and the rest of it. You get the right mix.
I was going to say,
you don't suffer anymore. And there's something really scary about it. Because they really believe maybe that's true, but from a Buddhist point of view, that's you're never going to find that. That's chemical induced nirvana.
maybe.
What's that?
Conductant.
A little dabble, do you? Right, Mr. Jackson?
I do remember the Enlightenment Serum letter, and I actually had furthered my studies quite a lot in that area. And let's just say a little bit of oxytocin mixed in with, a little bit of dopamine.
You've been self-administering this idea that the brain is the source of all happiness and suffering, and so you can control happiness and suffering through controlling the brain, of course, leads to the quest for drugs.
It's like, do you remember Homer's The Odyssey, isn't it? And the land of the lotus eaters, where they try to trap him there and, essentially, I guess more opium-based or whatever, drugs, or, the forgetfulness of pleasure. You might be able to trap people in that for a while, but is that pleasure equate to happiness? And I think that's where things start to fall down, and when people start getting sick and approach death, are they going to feel, maybe it was worth it, or they'll suddenly think, actually maybe there was more to life and to death than just getting hooked on drugs.
The other quick thing about the measuring the brainwaves with the Buddhist meditators is that this has been going on now for at least about 40 years, I think. But still, it hasn't delivered anything. I mean, it hasn't delivered anything, nothing. At what point are people going to question, like, the question that the book raises, which is, what's the point in this? Where is this going? What are the promises you're making? Have you got any idea when they're going to deliver anything? And how can we check our progress? Because it hasn't delivered anything.
Science doesn't have a lot of space in it for compassion. It tries to understand it from a neurological or a hormonal point of view. It's one of the common complaints you hear about people talking about science is it's so clinical that there is no room for any sense of compassion there. And it's why we see things like it's easy to justify experimenting on animals, because we want to be we hold the virtue of empiricism and objectivity above all else.
These animals will be infected with dengue fever virus, but there are animals that don't cope with it very well. So if we can put them in another group, they will go into a group, and otherwise they need to be euthanized.
But that's why Buddhism, I don't think, need to take anything from science, because we embrace through direct experience that compassion is a key component to being sentient. And science struggles with that. And so rather than Buddhism playing catch up with science, it really should be the other way around. It's like, well, science is a very useful tool, doesn't address a lot of things, but let's not disregard it. But compassion, it seems to be a little bit more of a priority.
Yeah. There's one other point, about this, which we didn't really cover so much, which I think the part of the claim of the book is that when people say Buddhism should be more scientific, what they're really saying is it should adopt more materialist views about the world, that everything is matter. So there's a strong part of this chapter, wasn't there? It was about, but if we accept that everything is matter, then the notion of future and past lives, is out the window. And then the notion of karma and actions and ethical behavior is the cause of happiness and suffering. That goes out the window. Then all the teachings on precious human birth and impermanence and suffering will go out. Basically, if you adopt what through scientism is often, equates to some degree anyway, materialism. If we try to bring in materialism into the Buddhist doctrine, then you lose what it is to be Buddhist.
But does it though? Why does science? It's an important point to make though. But why the science and rebirth can't exist together? Why does
science doesn't say anything about it, but scientism, when people don't know what science really is, which we've been talking about, isn't it? Where they think actually what science really is a philosophical view that everything is matter, and science can, because it's good at managing matter, can then manage everything, including what it is to live and happiness and suffering. The drug point, isn't it? If people mistake science for scientism, and in particular mistake it for the philosophical view of materialism, then the mixing of that with Buddhism would destroy Buddhism.
Not only is it a danger that karma, rebirth, and all these transcendent and enlightenment, all these transcendental principles will go out the window. It's not only a danger, but it's actually happened, because that's what many people have done to Buddhism. So the mindfulness movement is all about, has done that. And many modern forms of Buddhism have done that. They see that people are quite attached to their materialistic worldview, which denies karma, rebirth, and enlightenment and liberation. And so they say, okay, well, I don't believe in that either. But here's a meditation technique, and this is Buddhism. So these amputated forms of Buddhism. And it goes back to a question that John made this point in the comments, is to what extent does Buddhism meet those people? So if you're a materialist, to what extent do we as Buddhists go to materialists and say, okay, you believe in you don't believe in these things, you believe in everything is physical. To meet the materialist and allow them to continue with materialistic beliefs is to lose Buddhism. It's to lose the most essential parts of it. The cause of suffering and the cause of liberation, the four noble truths.
Yeah, I remember when I first met Lama Jampa and was talking a bit about this topic, and he said to me that to become a Buddhist you need to at least have an openness to the possibility of future and past lives. Because at the time I was really being a materialist, and so I was really struggling. I could get the non-duality bit and maybe emptiness view and the rest of it, but future past lives, the continuity of mind and so on is really hard to deal with. But that advice helped me keep going and keep looking and examining and questioning until I got comfortable with what it really meant. and in the book, again, actually, we skipped this whole section on this, which was really what is rebirth about. And Lama Zopa is explaining it's not just about reincarnation, life to life. In fact, it's a lot more subtle and profound than that. The doctrine of rebirth in Buddhism is how, even though what we are is flow and flux and process and continual change, we're continually creating creating ourselves again and again, being born again, creating, in a way, grasping onto our experience as me and I and my experience. And so even though everything's flux, we're projecting this delusory notion of a self and existence onto the world. And that we're doing that moment to moment. You can sort of see that when you meditate, and you can see mind and our experiences continual change, yet we have this grasping onto it. One thought after another is my thought, my experience, my feeling, my memory, my aspiration. And that grasping and deluded projection onto the reality of self is really the doctrine of rebirth. And why should we think it happens now? We can see it's happening now. Why do we think it's going to stop? You know, that's the point about rebirth and life to life as well, is that grasping nature of mind, the appropriation of reality into this deluded notion of self and other continues after death.
I like that you mentioned that that's what Lama told you when you first started getting interested in Buddhism, was to keep an open mind about rebirth, because it harkens to like Shakespeare's Hamlet quote of "There are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in your philosophy." Is that, you know, when doesn't having an open mind about something serve you some benefit? But in today's society, with the imposition of scientism, we see that open mind being very much bookended. And like, if you have an open, inquisitive mind, you're pretty quickly labeled and cancelled in all manners.
Except that materialism is permitted. It's a permitted dogma. Materialism, you know, because the idea that there is no past and future lives is really predicated on the idea that mind is based on physical substance only. So when the body dies and starts to decompose, then the mind dies with it and is no more. That dogma and that belief that everything is ultimately physical is permitted. No one ever, there isn't anything like that.
It's enforced. It's more than permitted. I think it's enforced.
Right. Yeah, and it's ingrained, because people have so much difficulty with doctrines like rebirth and modern people in the West, so much difficulty with rebirth and karma, even without really understanding in a more sophisticated way, like Paul's pointing to, what these things are really pointing to. But they have no difficulty at all with materialism and scientism to a degree. These things just accept it. But there are so many problems with materialism, philosophical and societal, and for the individual, as we've seen.
Yeah, but it seems to come partly from our previous episodes, isn't it? The Christian background to our society, and the rejection of Christianity, and the lurch into materialism. So it's a bit like growing up. You're a Christian, if not, and you're secular, then really you're more a materialist. I think those seems to be the sort of two dominant views in our age. It's, it's those who still hold on to Christianity, and otherwise reject Christianity and lurch into materialism.
It's been a good discussion of science. Okay, good. Norin's putting his mask back on. I think we all feel a lot safer. Appreciate that. So we'll be back next week, in a couple of weeks, to talk about politics. That's going to be a good one.